The morning sun cast long shadows across Naval Air Station Fallen as Captain Vera, deadshot. Kozlowski methodically replaced paper targets at the 500-yard line. Her worn flight suit bore the faded patches of 3 combat deployments, but today she was just another range officer performing mundane duties. The irony wasn't lost on her. A pilot who'd flown 73 combat missions over hostile territory was now stapling bullseyes to wooden frames in the Nevada desert. Target replacement grid 7, she radioed to the range tower, her voice steady despite the frustration simmering beneath. The response crackled back through static. Copy, deadshot, clear to work. Behind her, a group of Navy SEALs waited with practiced patience, their Barrett .50 caliber rifles gleaming in the desert heat. She could feel their eyes on her as she worked, probably wondering what a pilot was doing on their precision shooting range. What they didn't know was that Vera Kozlowski held the unofficial record for the longest confirmed sniper kill by an aviator, a Taliban commander at 1,847 yards, taken from a disabled helicopter in the mountains of Afghanistan 3 years ago. The lead SEAL, a weathered chief petty officer with silver temples, stepped forward as she finished securing the last target. "Ma'am, we're ready to commence firing exercises." His tone was respectful but distant, the way enlisted men spoke to officers they didn't know. Vera nodded, stepping back toward the observation bunker. But something made her pause. Perhaps it was the way the wind shifted across the range, or how the late morning light caught the mirage shimmers rising from the heated sand. She turned back to watch the SEALs take their positions. The first shooter settled behind his rifle, adjusting his scope with mechanical precision. Through her binoculars, Vera could see his technique was textbook perfect, breathing controlled, body positioned flawlessly. But there was something off about his sight picture, a barely perceptible cant to his rifle that would send his shots wide at distance. 5 degrees left windage, she murmured to herself, then louder. "Chief, your shooter's canted slightly right." The chief petty officer looked up sharply. The other SEALs exchanged glances. In their world, precision was everything, and criticism from an outsider, especially a flyby, wasn't welcome. But something in Vera's tone made the chief hesitate. This wasn't a guess. It was the voice of someone who knew. The first shot rang out, echoing across the desert. Through the spotting scope, the chief watched the bullet impact 2 inches left of center at 500 yards, exactly where the cant would have placed it. He looked at Vera with new interest, his weathered face betraying nothing, but his eyes asking the question his rank wouldn't let him voice. Lieutenant Commander Marcus Ironside Blackwood approached the firing line with the quiet confidence of a man accustomed to impossible shots. His Barrett M82A1 had been his companion through 6 deployments, its matte black finish worn smooth in places by countless hours of handling. The rifle weighed 30 pounds fully loaded, but in his hands it seemed weightless as he settled into position behind the massive weapon. "Target acquisition 800 yards, he announced, his voice carrying the calm authority that had made him legendary among West Coast SEAL teams. Through his scope, the white center of the target appeared crisp and clean, floating in the shimmer of desert heat. His breathing slowed to the methodical rhythm taught in sniper school: inhale, exhale halfway, hold, squeeze. The trigger broke cleanly with a sound like breaking glass. The massive .50 caliber round erupted from the muzzle with a thunderclap that rolled across the range like distant artillery. Downrange, a small puff of dust marked the bullet's impact, 6 inches high and left of the bullseye. Blackwood's jaw tightened imperceptibly. In 7 years of competitive shooting, he'd never missed by more than 2 inches at that distance. Behind him, he heard the other SEALs shifting uncomfortably. Reputation was currency in the special operations community, and his had just taken a hit. "Wind's tricky today," offered Petty Officer Rodriguez, though they all knew the flags showed only a gentle crosswind from the right. "Mirage is heavy," agreed Chief Petty Officer Thompson, but his tone lacked conviction. Vera watched from the observation deck, her trained eye already identifying the problem. The rifle's bipod legs were uneven on the sandy ground, creating a subtle tilt that threw off the natural point of aim. It was the kind of mistake that separated good shooters from great ones, not a lack of skill, but a failure to read the environment completely. She descended from the observation platform, her boots crunching softly on the gravel. The SEALs watched her approach with expressions ranging from curious to skeptical. A pilot offering shooting advice to Navy SEALs was like a mechanic telling a surgeon how to operate. "Mind if I take a look?" she asked Blackwood, her tone carefully neutral. The lieutenant commander hesitated. Protocol dictated that he maintain authority over his team's training, but something about this captain's confidence intrigued him. He'd heard whispers about a pilot who'd made impossible shots from aircraft, though he dismissed them as the usual embellished war stories that circulated through military bases. "Permission granted," he said finally, stepping aside but remaining close enough to intervene if necessary. Vera knelt beside the massive rifle, her hands hovering over it without touching. She studied the bipod placement, the rifle's alignment, the way shadows fell across the action. Her eyes moved from the weapon to the target and back again, calculating angles and distances with the unconscious precision of someone who'd spent years making life-and-death decisions based on ballistic mathematics. "Your bipod's sitting in soft sand," she said quietly. "Left leg's sunk about 3 millimeters deeper than the right." The observation was so specific, so precise, that even the skeptical SEALs leaned in to look. Through their trained eyes, they could now see what she meant, an almost invisible difference in the rifle's cant that would indeed throw shots left and high at distance. "Jesus," Rodriguez muttered under his breath, "how'd you catch that?" Vera didn't answer immediately. Instead, she gestured to a patch of harder ground 18 inches to the right. "Try from there. Firm base, level shooting platform. Your natural point of aim will be true." Blackwood studied her face, searching for any hint of arrogance or superiority. He found none, only the quiet confidence of a professional sharing expertise with another professional. Slowly, he moved his rifle to the position she'd indicated. The difference was immediate and obvious. Through his scope, the target appeared centered and stable, the crosshairs naturally settling on the bulls, without the subtle drift he'd been unconsciously compensating for. He settled into his shooting position again, his breathing falling into the familiar rhythm. This time, the shot broke with mathematical precision. Downrange, the spotting scope revealed a perfect center hit, the bullet hole appearing exactly where his crosshairs had been placed. The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the whisper of desert wind across the range. "Dead center," called the spotter, his voice carrying a note of amazement. The transformation in the SEAL's demeanor was subtle but unmistakable. Shoulders straightened slightly, expressions shifted from skeptical to attentive, and the space around Vera seemed to expand as they unconsciously granted her the respect reserved for proven professionals. Chief Thompson was the first to speak, his gravelly voice cutting through the desert air. "Ma'am, that was some catch. You shoot competitively." The question hung in the air like heat shimmer, loaded with implications. In the special operations community, shooting wasn't just a skill. It was an art form, a science, and sometimes the difference between life and death. To recognize a problem that had escaped the notice of some of the military's most elite marksmen wasn't luck. It was expertise of the highest order. Vera's response was characteristically understated. "I've had some practice." But Blackwood wasn't satisfied with deflection. His reputation had been salvaged by this pilot's intervention, and professional curiosity was eating at him. "Ma'am, with respect, that wasn't beginner's luck. You saw something we all missed and you saw it fast. That takes experience." The other SEALs nodded agreement, their earlier skepticism replaced by genuine interest. In their world, Competence was the only currency that mattered, and Vera had just demonstrated she possessed it in abundance. "I spent some time downrange," she said finally, the phrase carrying weight that every combat veteran understood. Downrange meant combat zones, hostile territory, places where mistakes killed people and precision meant survival. "Flying or shooting?" Rodriguez asked, though his tone suggested he already suspected the answer. "Both." The single-word response was pure military understatement, but it spoke volumes to the assembled SEALs. Pilots who shot weren't uncommon. Most aircrew received basic marksmanship training. But pilots who shot well enough to spot cant errors invisible to Navy SEALs were a different breed entirely. Thompson exchanged glances with Blackwood, a silent communication passing between the senior enlisted man and the officer. They'd both been around long enough to recognize genuine expertise when they encountered it, regardless of the source. "Captain," Thompson said carefully, "would you mind if we asked what aircraft you fly?" "FA-18 Super Hornet," Vera replied. "Strike fighter pilot, 3 combat deployments, Afghanistan, Iraq, and 1 classified operation I can't discuss." The revelation landed like a bomb among the SEALs. Strike fighter pilots were elite aviators, but their reputation was built on flying, not shooting. The idea that one of them could outspot Navy SEALs on a shooting range challenged their assumptions about professional hierarchies and specialized expertise. Blackwood found himself reassessing everything he thought he knew about aviators. "Ma'am, forgive me for asking, but how does a pilot learn to spot cant errors that fine?" Vera's expression grew distant, her eyes focusing on something beyond the desert horizon. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of memory and loss. "When your aircraft goes down behind enemy lines, and your survival depends on making shots that shouldn't be possible, you learn to see everything. Every detail matters when there's no backup coming and no second chances." The silence that followed was different from before, not the quiet of professional assessment, but the respectful hush that combat veterans accorded to someone who'd faced death and prevailed through skill and determination. Rodriguez was the first to break the silence. "Ma'am, what's your longest confirmed kill?" The question was asked with the casual directness of one warrior to another, but Vera's answer would shatter every assumption they'd made about pilots and shooting. 1,847 yards, Taliban commander, Hindu Kush Mountains, 2021. The number fell into the desert air like a stone into still water, creating ripples of shock that spread through the assembled SEALs. 1,800 yards was an extraordinary shot for anyone. For a pilot, it was almost incomprehensible. "From aircraft?" Blackwood asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "Ground. Bird went down, crew chief was wounded, and we had hostiles moving in from 3 directions. Found an M24 sniper rifle in our survival kit and took the shot from a ridgeline." Her voice remained steady, professional, but her eyes held the distant look of someone remembering a moment when everything hung in the balance. Thompson whistled low under his breath. "Jesus Christ, ma'am, that's beyond expert level, that's." "Lucky," Vera interrupted, but her tone suggested otherwise. "Bullshit," Rodriguez said with the bluntness that came naturally to enlisted men. "Luck doesn't spot cant errors invisible to SEALs. Luck doesn't make 1,800-yard shots in combat conditions." The other team members nodded agreement, their respect now tinged with something approaching awe. They'd all made long shots, all pushed the boundaries of what was possible with precision rifles, but what Vera was describing transcended normal expectations of marksmanship. Blackwood studied her face, nodding the way she held herself, not with arrogance or pride, but with the quiet confidence of someone who'd been tested in the crucible of combat and emerged victorious. "Ma'am, would you be willing to demonstrate? I mean, if you're comfortable with it." The request carried layers of meaning. It was part challenge, part invitation and part plea from professionals desperate to learn from someone whose skills exceeded their own. In the special operations community, ego was secondary to excellence, and if this pilot could teach them something, pride wouldn't prevent them from learning. Vera looked at the assembled SEALs, seeing in their faces the same hunger for knowledge that had driven her to master her craft. These weren't men seeking to diminish her accomplishments. They were warriors recognizing another warrior and asking to learn from her experience. "What distance?" she asked simply. "Your choice, ma'am," Blackwood replied, stepping aside and gesturing toward his Barrett. "Whatever you're comfortable with." Vera approached the massive rifle with the careful respect it deserved. The M82A1 was a precision instrument weighing more than most assault rifles, its .50 caliber rounds capable of disabling vehicles and defeating body armor at ranges exceeding a mile. She'd trained on similar weapons during survival school, but this was the first time she'd handled one since that desperate day in the mountains of Afghanistan. Her hands moved over the rifle with practiced familiarity, checking the action, testing the trigger pull, examining the scope mounts and adjustment turrets. Every movement was economical and purposeful, the actions of someone who understood that equipment failure could mean death. "Range cards current?" she asked Thompson, who handed over a laminated card showing distances and wind corrections for the range. She studied it briefly, her eyes moving from the data to the distant targets and back again. The morning sun was climbing higher, creating stronger thermals and heat mirage that would affect bullet trajectory. Wind flags showed a gentle crosswind from the right, but she could see dust devils forming in the distance that suggested changing conditions. "1,000 yards," she announced, selecting a target that appeared as a small white square in the desert haze. "Steel plate." The distance was significant, well beyond the range where most shooters could guarantee first-round hits, especially with an unfamiliar rifle. The SEALs exchanged glances, recognizing the challenge she'd set for herself. Vera settled behind the rifle, adjusting the bipod legs and checking her natural point of aim. The massive weapon's weight helped stabilize it, but the .50 caliber cartridge would generate tremendous recoil that could throw off follow-up shots if not managed properly. Through the high-powered scope, the target appeared larger but still challenging, a 12-inch steel square that would ring clearly when struck. She studied the wind flags again, noting subtle changes in direction and intensity that would affect the bullet's path over the nearly half-mile flight to target. Her breathing slowed to the methodical rhythm she'd learned in sniper school and perfected through necessity in combat. Inhale slowly, exhale halfway, hold, focus on the sight picture, squeeze the trigger with steady pressure until it broke like glass. The Barrett erupted with a thunderclap that echoed across the desert, the massive muzzle brake redirecting gases and reducing felt recoil. The rifle jumped in her hands but settled quickly back on target, her body absorbing the impact with practiced ease. Downrange, the distinctive clang of bullets striking steel rang across the range like a bell, confirming a direct hit before the spotters could call it. The sound was followed by the whistle of the ricochet as the spent bullet tumbled away into the desert. "Dead center," called the spotter, his voice carrying amazement. "Perfect hit." The SEALs stood in stunned silence, processing what they'd just witnessed. A pilot they'd never heard of had just made a cold-bore shot at 1,000 yards with an unfamiliar rifle, placing the bullet exactly where she'd aimed on the first try. Rodriguez shook his head slowly. "Ma'am, I've been shooting professionally for 8 years and I've never seen anything like that. That was surgical." Vera lifted her head from the scope, her expression unchanged. To her, the shot had been well within her capabilities, impressive perhaps, but not extraordinary given her training and experience. But she was beginning to understand that her skills were less common than she'd assumed. "Clean rifle, good optics, stable platform," she said simply. "The fundamentals are the same regardless of distance." But Blackwood knew better. The fundamentals were indeed the same, but applying them at extended range under varying conditions required a level of skill and experience that few possessed. What they just witnessed wasn't simply good marksmanship. It was mastery. "Ma'am," Thompson said carefully, "with respect, what you just did isn't normal. That's world-class shooting by any standard." Vera began to object, but Blackwood cut her off gently. "Captain, I've been a sniper for 7 years. I've trained with the best shooters in the military, competed at the highest levels, and I can count on one hand the number of people I've seen make cold-bore hits like that at 1,000 yards. The sincerity in his voice was unmistakable, and for the first time, Vera began to understand that her skills might be more exceptional than she'd realized. In her world of high-performance aviation, precision was expected, and excellence was the minimum standard. She'd never considered that her marksmanship abilities might translate to recognition in the ground combat community. "I had good teachers," she said finally, deflecting credit in the way that military professionals often did. "Maybe," Rodriguez agreed, "but teaching can only take you so far. The rest has to come from somewhere else: natural ability, dedication, experience under pressure. You've got all three." The conversation was interrupted by the crackle of radio static from the range tower. "Deadshot, this is range control. Time check for next firing evolution." Vera keyed her radio automatically. "Range control, Deadshot. Current evolution complete. Range is clear for next scheduled training." As she spoke, she noticed the subtle change in the SEAL's expressions. They'd heard her call sign, Deadshot, and were processing its implications. Call signs in the military weren't chosen randomly. They reflected reputation, capability, or memorable incidents. A pilot called Deadshot had earned the name somehow. Thompson was the first to make the connection. "Ma'am, is Deadshot your actual call sign?" "It is." "How'd you earn it?" Rodriguez asked, though his tone suggested he might already suspect the answer. Vera hesitated, uncomfortable with the attention her shooting was generating. But she recognized the question as professional curiosity rather than idle gossip, and these SEALs had shown her nothing but respect since she'd proven her capabilities. "Training accident during flight school," she said finally. "Instructor pilot had to make an emergency landing in a remote area. Local wildlife, specifically a pack of coyotes, decided to investigate. I convinced them to find somewhere else to be." The explanation was characteristically understated, but the SEALs understood the implications. Survival situations that required shooting wildlife were rare, and successfully resolving them required both skill and composure under pressure. "How many shots?" Blackwood asked. "One." The single-word answer hung in the desert air, confirming what the SEALs had already begun to suspect. This wasn't just a pilot who could shoot well. This was someone whose marksmanship skills had been tested and proven in real-world situations where failure meant serious consequences. "Ma'am," Thompson said with growing respect, "would you be willing to stay and observe our training evolution? We'd welcome your input." The invitation was significant. Navy SEALs didn't often ask outsiders to critique their training, especially in areas where they considered themselves expert. But Vera had demonstrated abilities that exceeded their own, and professional pride took second place to the opportunity to learn from superior skill. Vera glanced at her watch, calculating the time remaining in her duty day. Her official responsibilities as range officer were complete, but she found herself genuinely interested in working with these professionals. Their willingness to acknowledge her expertise and learn from it spoke well of their character and dedication to excellence. "I can stay for another hour," she agreed. The mood on the firing line shifted immediately. What had begun as routine training for the SEALs was transforming into something more valuable: a masterclass in precision shooting from someone whose abilities clearly exceeded standard expectations. Rodriguez was already adjusting his rifle setup, incorporating the lessons learned from watching Vera's demonstration. "Ma'am, what other corrections should we be looking for?" The question opened the floodgates. For the next hour, Vera moved among the SEAL snipers, offering observations and corrections that improved their accuracy dramatically. She identified scope mounting issues, breathing problems, trigger control errors, and environmental reading mistakes that had been limiting their precision. But more than technical instruction, she provided a different perspective on marksmanship. Where the SEALs approached shooting as a mechanical skill to be perfected through repetition, Vera treated it as an art form requiring intuition, adaptation, and constant awareness of changing conditions. "The rifle and scope are just tools," she explained as Rodriguez struggled with a particularly challenging shot at 1,200 yards. "The real accuracy comes from reading everything the environment is telling you: wind, temperature, humidity, mirage, even the way shadows fall across your target." Under her guidance, Rodriguez's shooting improved noticeably. Shots that had been scattering around the target began clustering tightly in the center, and his confidence grew with each successful engagement. Thompson, watching from the observation point, shook his head in amazement. "7 years I've been training snipers, and I've never seen improvement this fast. She's got a gift for teaching." Blackwood nodded agreement, but his expression was thoughtful. "It's more than teaching ability. She's showing us things we never knew to look for. That takes a level of understanding that goes beyond normal training." As the training session continued, the SEALs began to grasp the depth of Vera's expertise. Her observations weren't limited to basic marksmanship. She understood ballistics at a level that bordered on instinctive, could read environmental conditions with uncanny accuracy, and possessed an intuitive grasp of how multiple variables combine to affect bullet trajectory. "Ma'am," Thompson said during a brief pause, "I have to ask, where did you learn to shoot like this? This isn't standard pilot training." Vera's expression grew distant again, her eyes focusing on the mountains visible in the haze beyond the range. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of experiences she rarely discussed. "Started hunting with my grandfather when I was 8. He was a Marine sniper in Korea, and he taught me that shooting wasn't about the gun. It was about understanding everything around you and becoming part of the environment." She paused, gathering memories that were both painful and precious. "After I joined the Navy, I sought out additional training whenever possible. Went to Army Sniper School during leave time, trained with Marine Scout snipers, even spent time with Canadian JTF-2 learning their techniques." The revelation explained much but raised even more questions. Pilots who pursued advanced ground combat training during their personal time were rare, suggesting a level of dedication and interest that went well beyond normal professional requirements. "Why?" Rodriguez asked simply. The question was broader than it appeared, encompassing not just her motivation for additional training, but her entire approach to developing skills that weren't directly related to her primary occupation as a naval aviator. Vera was quiet for a long moment, considering how to explain something that had driven her for years, but which she'd never fully articulated to herself. "Because," she said finally, "in aviation there's always backup. Redundant systems, emergency procedures, support aircraft, search and rescue. But sometimes you find yourself in situations where all of that fails, and the only thing standing between you and disaster is what you can do with your own hands." The answer resonated deeply with the SEALs, who understood better than most the importance of individual capability and self-reliance. In their world, backup was often miles away or non-existent, and survival depended on personal skill and preparation. "Afghanistan," Blackwood asked quietly. "Among other places." Vera's tone indicated that was all she intended to say about specific deployments, but the SEALs understood. Combat veterans often carried experiences they couldn't or wouldn't discuss, even with other professionals. As the afternoon wore on, the training session evolved into something approaching an informal symposium on advanced marksmanship. Vera shared techniques and insights that challenged conventional wisdom, while the SEALs contributed their own experiences and observations. The mutual exchange of knowledge created an atmosphere of professional camaraderie that transcended normal rank and service boundaries. Here were warriors united by common dedication to excellence, regardless of their specific roles or backgrounds. When the session finally ended, the transformation in both the SEALs' shooting and their attitude toward Vera was remarkable. Scores had improved across the board, but more importantly, they'd gained insights that would serve them throughout their careers. Thompson approached as Vera began packing her equipment. "Ma'am, I want to thank you for today. What you've shared with us. It's going to make us better at our jobs, and in our line of work, better can mean the difference between coming home and not coming home." The gravity in his voice underscored the importance of what had occurred. This hadn't been an academic exercise or casual training. It was potentially life-saving instruction that could determine outcomes in future combat situations. Vera nodded acknowledgement, but her expression suggested she considered the exchange mutually beneficial. "You're professionals doing important work. If I can contribute to your success, that's worthwhile." Blackwood stepped forward, extending his hand. "Captain, it's been an honor training with you. If you're ever interested in working with us again, we'd welcome the opportunity." The invitation was significant, representing acceptance into a community that rarely opened its doors to outsiders. Navy SEALs trained almost exclusively with other special operations personnel, and extending an offer to a pilot indicated the highest level of professional respect. As Vera shook hands with each of the SEALs, she realized that something fundamental had shifted during the afternoon. She'd begun the day as a pilot performing routine range duties, but was ending it as a recognized expert whose skills had earned respect from some of the military's most elite warriors. "Thank you for the opportunity," she said simply. "I learned as much from you as you did from me." But even as she spoke the words, Vera knew they weren't entirely true. What she'd learned wasn't technical, it was personal. For the first time in her career, she'd encountered professionals who valued her marksmanship abilities as highly as her flying skills, who saw her as more than just a pilot who happened to shoot well. The drive back to her quarters was quiet, giving Vera time to process the afternoon's events. The SEAL's reaction to her shooting had been far more dramatic than she'd expected, suggesting that her skills were more exceptional than she'd realized. But more than recognition of her abilities, what struck her was the quality of respect she'd received. These weren't men easily impressed or quick to acknowledge superior skill, yet they treated her as a peer and sought her instruction without hesitation once she'd proven herself. It was a new experience for a pilot accustomed to professional isolation. Aviation was a solitary profession in many ways. You flew alone, made decisions alone, and succeeded or failed, based largely on individual capability. The collaborative learning environment she'd experienced with the SEALs was refreshing and energizing. That evening, as she sat in her quarters reviewing the day's events, Vera found herself wondering if she'd been limiting herself by focusing exclusively on aviation. Her marksmanship skills were clearly at a level that could contribute to other areas of military operations, but she'd never seriously considered how to leverage them professionally. A knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. Outside stood Chief Thompson, holding a manila folder and wearing an expression that suggested official business. "Ma'am, sorry to bother you during your off time, but I wanted to follow up on today's training session." He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. "There's something I think you should know about." Vera invited him in, curious about what could be important enough to warrant an evening visit. Thompson's demeanor suggested this wasn't a social call or simple follow-up to the afternoon's activities. Ma'am, what I'm about to tell you isn't widely known, but given what I witnessed today, I think you should be aware of it. Thompson opened the folder, revealing several official-looking documents. There's a joint special operations program being developed that specifically recruits personnel with exceptional marksmanship abilities, regardless of their primary military occupation. The revelation was intriguing. Vieira had heard rumors of various special programs and classified units, but nothing specifically focused on precision shooting skills. The program is called Project Longshot, Thompson continued, and it's designed to provide precision fire support for special operations missions that require capabilities beyond standard sniper teams. They're looking for individuals who can make shots that shouldn't be possible under conditions that would challenge even experienced snipers. He handed her a document that bore multiple classification markings and official seals. Based on what I saw today, you'd be an ideal candidate. Your demonstrated abilities exceed the program's minimum requirements by a significant margin. Vieira scanned the document quickly, noting references to advanced training, specialized equipment, and mission profiles that remained classified. The program appeared to be legitimate and well-funded, with support from multiple military branches and government agencies. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked. Thompson's expression was serious. "Because talent like yours is rare, ma'am. What you demonstrated today isn't something that can be taught. It's a combination of natural ability, extensive training, and combat experience that produces exceptional results. The military needs people like you in roles where they can make the greatest contribution." The implication was clear. Thompson believed her skills were being underutilized in her current role, and he was presenting an opportunity to apply them in a more specialized capacity. "What would it involve?" Vieira asked, though she wasn't sure she was ready for the answer. "I don't know all the details. Much of it remains classified until you're actually accepted into the program. But from what I understand, it would involve advanced training, specialized missions, and working with some of the military's most elite units." Thompson paused. "It would also mean leaving aviation, at least temporarily." The statement hit like a physical blow. Aviation had been Vieira's life for over a decade, her identity and passion. The idea of leaving it, even for an opportunity to apply her other skills, was almost inconceivable. "I appreciate the information, Chief, but I'm a pilot. That's what I do, that's who I am." Thompson nodded understanding, but his expression suggested he'd expected this response. "Ma'am, with respect, today proved you're more than just a pilot. You're a warrior with exceptional abilities that could save lives and accomplish missions that others can't. Sometimes we have to consider whether we're doing the greatest good with the talents we've been given." After Thompson left, Vieira sat alone with the classified documents, reading and rereading the limited information available about Project Longshot. The program seemed legitimate and important, but accepting would mean fundamentally changing the direction of her career. She thought about the afternoon's training session, remembering the satisfaction she'd felt sharing knowledge with the SEALs and watching their skills improve under her instruction. There had been a sense of purpose there that she rarely experienced in routine flight operations. But aviation was more than a job. It was a calling that had driven her since childhood. The idea of giving up flying, even temporarily, felt like abandoning a fundamental part of herself. The internal conflict kept her awake long into the night, weighing duty against passion, considering whether her greatest contribution to the military lay in the cockpit or behind a rifle scope. By morning, she still hadn't reached a decision, but she knew the choice would define the next phase of her career and possibly her life. The decision would have to wait, however, because at 600 hours, her pager buzzed with an emergency message that would change everything. "Report to base commander immediately. Priority 1. National security implications." As Vieira dressed hurriedly and prepared to respond to the summons, She had no way of knowing that the shooting demonstration she'd given the day before had already been reported up the chain of command, and that Project Longshot wasn't just recruiting. They were actively seeking her specifically. The base commander's office was filled with people she didn't recognize when Vera arrived at 6:30. Besides Colonel Harrison, the base commanding officer, there were two men in civilian clothes who had the unmistakable bearing of intelligence officers, a Navy captain she'd never seen before, and Chief Thompson, who avoided eye contact when she entered. "Captain Kozlowski, thank you for responding promptly," Colonel Harrison began, his tone suggesting this wasn't a routine meeting. "I'll get straight to the point. Yesterday's training session has attracted attention at levels far above this installation." Vera felt a chill of apprehension. In the military, attention from higher headquarters was rarely positive, especially when it came without warning or explanation. One of the civilian men stepped forward, introducing himself as Director James Walsh from an agency he didn't name. "Captain, we've received reports of your marksmanship demonstration yesterday that frankly strain credibility. A cold bore shot at 1,000 yards with an unfamiliar rifle, followed by instruction that dramatically improved the performance of experienced SEAL snipers." The statement was factual but carried implications that made Vera uncomfortable. She glanced at Thompson, wondering how detailed his report had been and to whom it had been submitted. "Sir, I simply assisted with a training evolution, nothing more." Walsh smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Captain, false modesty serves no one here. We have video footage of your shooting, witness statements from multiple Navy SEALs, and documentation of accuracy improvements that border on impossible." The revelation that their training had been recorded was disturbing. Vera hadn't noticed any cameras on the range, but intelligence agencies had resources and capabilities that weren't always visible. Colonel Harrison leaned forward in his chair. "Vera, what these gentlemen are telling me is that your demonstrated abilities have caught the attention of some very important people in Washington, people who have uses for someone with your particular combination of skills." The phrasing was ominous. In Vera's experience, when Washington took interest in individual service members, it usually meant assignment to dangerous, classified, or politically sensitive operations. The Navy captain, who had remained silent until now, finally spoke. "Captain Kozlowski, I'm Captain Sarah Mitchell, Office of Naval Intelligence. What we're discussing here is an opportunity for you to serve your country in a capacity that utilizes your full range of abilities." Walsh opened a briefcase and removed several documents. "Project Longshot is real, Captain, and we've been searching for personnel with your specific qualifications for over 2 years. What you demonstrated yesterday represents exactly the type of capability we need." Vera found herself in the